Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I hope your reading week was an enjoyable one. I know mine was great. I had a chance to visit the Maritimes and return to the place that formed me. So I am currently traveling in transit right now. So after you see this video, if you're watching on Tuesday exactly, and you try to get a hold of me on Tuesday or Wednesday, I am currently making the drive back to Ottawa to resume my work and other studies. So, just if you try to get a hold of me on Tuesday or Wednesday, that is February the 26th or 27th. Right now, you might get spotty connection, or you'll see an email saying this was sent from a cell phone. But I know that some of you had a chance to go places, do things wonderful. I also should let you all know that by now you should have your first two critical reflections returned and marked. So everyone who submitted their assignments online will have had those returned and marked with feedback by now. There were some of you who submitted them via email, and I should have responded to everyone to either say submit that through the online portal, or I sent you your comments and grades via email. Now, I've been informed by someone in tech support at St. Mary's that I cannot upload the file on your behalf. So if you send it to me via email and you did not get an email from me saying, actually, can you re-upload this, which I know I've done for some of you. If that's not the case, please just let me know. I don't think anyone's fallen through the cracks. It's just that there are 2 or 3 cases of people who withdrew from the course sort of after doing the first assignment. So I'm not certain right now if the people who have submitted online line up perfectly with the people who are still in the class. I'm still waiting. The registrar's office is putting together a list for me. So that's simply to say that now that I'm telling you, you should have received your 2 assignments marked and available on Brightspace. If you do not have 2 assignments available and marked on Brightspace, it's probably because you submitted something to me via email, and that just hasn't. You weren't one of the people to get the email to say upload that again if you can. The portal is still available. So even if you have assignment 1 and it's marked and you know your grade, I ask that you still just upload that back in the introduction. So the methodology week 2, the Dropbox submission portal is still available for you to put up your assignment, even though it's already marked. So that's just a way that I can then collate all of the grades in a way that satisfies the powers that be of online education, so that they can basically have a track record of all the assignments and when they went in. So otherwise, those assignments have been very good. It's been excellent to see just what it is, just what you're grasping and how you've been able to put together the ideas from contemporary and classical authors. And I've just had a chance to begin marking of the op-ed critical reflection, or the op-ed assignments. Good work again. So that's been very comforting, very happy to see. And frankly, it's been some fascinating reads, even just in the pieces that you've decided to look at. So thank you for that. Now, at this point, we are beginning what's sure to be a very interesting and for some of you frustrating, for some of you enlightening examination of war and peace. So if you've had a chance to look at the readings right now, you'll see that we've got pieces essentially defending a version of just war theory, and this is all something that is framed by Gill and many other ethicists today as a way of thinking about conflict in between state actors. So the idea of war being a form of violence, being a form of violent conflict in between 2 sovereign powers. What does that mean, and why do we care about the idea of war versus violence, let's say? That's something that's going to be immediately apparent in how, right now in this week, Augustine, Aquinas, and Luther all talk about violence and conflict and make appeals to support it in ways that are very different from the way you and I would talk about, say, picking a fight. Because the type of violence that is state-sanctioned is seen in a very different way than private killings or private violence. And throughout Christian reflection on violent conflict, from the earliest church fathers up until today, there has been two predominant ways of thinking about the church that informs and influences how we think about violence. And so these are two ways that underlie the four-point typology that we see in Gill. It's not unique to Gill. It's a common way of dividing up the relation. And this sort of four-way typology is not unique to how we think about war and peace. So imagine you've got sort of a Cartesian plane. So you have a graph, or you have an axis, x-axis, y-axis, and then above the line, below the line, left, right. So you have this idea of, let's do it this way. We have militarism on one side, pacifism on the other. So this is the militaristic side, pacifist, and then you have a thoroughgoing, or let's say enthusiastic militarism and enthusiastic pacifism. Similarly, you have selective, or some people would use reluctant militarism, reluctant pacifism. You find similar typological distinctions like that in versions of political control, where you have your typical model that would say high government control, so authoritarianism and economic freedom. That type of graph gives you the distinctions of communism and fascism, which are both forms of authoritarian control, one of them having significant influence on economic life, so communism, and then fascism would be more or less laissez-faire when it comes to economic issues. Then you have reduced versions of those things. You have a type of laissez-faire capitalism and laissez-faire socialism. That type of four-way quadrant graph to explain the differences in between two opposing positions is common. There's a similar method known as Barber's four types of interaction in the science-religion dialogue that makes a similar divisive pattern. But for our purposes, what we care about is the idea that there is such a thing as Christian accounts of militarism or support for war, and there are such things as Christian accounts of pacifism or the rejection of violence, specifically state-sponsored violence. And as you can see, it works very well for how the church has thought about violence. However, I cannot stress enough that all three of our sources write in a post-Constantinian context. And so the idea that there are multiple options to consider is something that only emerges from that post-Constantinian position. So at a moment where the church emerges as a viable religious institution with legitimacy within the public sphere, you first, after that, encounter Christians saying, perhaps it's all right to fight. And that's because the change encountered by the church, once it receives legitimacy from the Roman Empire, is usually given the name, or it's defined by social scientists as having gone from being a sect to a church. And so there are characteristics that we associate with what it means to be a sect, what it means to be a church. So sects themselves are different from new religious movements in that they are not sort of cut from whole cloth. This distinction originates in the work of sociologist Max Weber, but has been elaborated on not only to sort of parse differences in between churches and sects, but also the way that cults form and other types of new religious movements. So the way in which these groups originate and the conditions from which those emerge are a source of fantastic insight, not only to the development of the Christian church, but religious movements around the world. So looking at the work of Weber or Alexander Johnston, what we see when we look at a sect is a group of believers or a religious movement, something akin almost to a revival, but fundamentally a new iteration. So it's not just an appeal to an old way of doing things with new vigor, but actually a movement that is born from a pre-existing milieu or religious environment that usually is set up to protest or to counteract elements of the dominant religion. So what we have here is an excellent example in early Christianity of a sect of Jesus believers emerging within Second Temple Judaism in and around Jerusalem, spreading throughout Palestine and through the missionary work of Paul and others, eventually spreading throughout the Roman Empire and beyond the Roman Empire to India, onwards to China. So that the idea of this new expression of the Jewish faith begins as a Jewish sect, and only over time is it understood that there's something fundamentally different and something that is ultimately incompatible. The development of Second Temple Judaism and the development of Christianity, what we came to know as Christianity, eventually need to part ways. And this happens inevitably because the function of a sect and the push of that first impulse to protest the original movement leads to one of three necessary conclusions. Now, so what can happen is either a new religious movement can dissolve, just fizzle out because of failure to attract new members. It can eventually be reincorporated, sometimes as something like a denomination, or even a new strand of thought. So you encounter this version, especially in the development of the family tree of forms of Buddhist practice, where what begins in an initial sect, so let's say the way in which something like Theravada Buddhism forms as a protest or a counterclaim to pre-existing types, the very particular forms of Zen Buddhism that we find in Japan emerges as perhaps not a full-on criticism, but a distinct version or flavor separate from Chinese forms of Buddhism. The reasons for this, admittedly, are because of some ethnic tensions between the two that were pre-existing, and so the development of a proper flavor. There are some types of emergence or development of sects that are more related to syncretism, and so the way in which Western influences have an effect on what we now know as Shambhala Buddhism is a direct reflection of how so many of the new converts and practitioners of Shambhala Buddhism were themselves deeply formed by Western cultural traditions, and so that emerges as something different from the strands of Buddhism that formed it. Certainly within the Christian church, we see things not only like the Protestant Reformation, but even before that, in the Huguenots of France, in the way in which particular versions of the church in North Africa come to define themselves as different or separate from the church that is centered in Rome. And these movements that push back, what begin within the church or within the religious tradition, they're sort of under the same big tent. either have to go off and pitch their own tent, or they have to build themselves a little box, something akin to a denomination inside, or sometimes they change the whole thing. So they become institutionalized, but really take over or transform the entire system. And that in some way is at work in how forms of the Protestant Reformation become reincorporated into structures created following the Counter-Reformation. So you have these sects that appear in religious contexts that are protests against the prevailing religious order. And then after that initial push, what happens? Either they dissolve, or they institutionalize, or they form their own separate kind of group. This is in 20th or 19th, 17th. So in recent studies, that's referred to as becoming a denomination, but that's a type of particular Christian nomenclature that is not found in other traditions. So those are your three options, though. Sects cannot continue to just be protest movements indefinitely. You lose that initial enthusiasm. So what happens in Christianity as it emerges and develops as a religion within the Roman Empire, it functions at first solely like a variant of the Jewish faith. And even as early as the 2nd century, we see a definitive split. We can now say that Jewish people, or those of a Jewish faith and those who have a Christian faith, are not coterminous. They do not see themselves as being one and the same. So this is not a case of simply Messianic Jews or some sort of identification on the part of individual believers that says, I am both a Jew and a Jesus, a follower of Yeshua Bar Yosef. That disappears by the 2nd century. But it's not until we get to this Constantinian declaration that Christianity as a civil religion, as one of the forms of faith in the public sphere, really gets its feet underneath itself, really thinks, okay, we have arrived. We can stop playing the underdog. And so the church, which had functioned and thought of itself as a sect up until this point, now has to reckon with itself as properly a church. And what makes a church different, again, this is from a sociological perspective. A church is an organization with much more stability. Churches generally make claims to universality. So that means that if, for example, in countries in Northern Europe, you might have within Germany, within Finland, within Sweden, you have national churches. And for a long period of time, if you were born in that country, you were a member of that church. That type of universal claim is associated with being a church. And they are very closely allied with authorities. So whether that's an explicitly state power, maybe it's a regional government, but churches are allied with state powers. They generally employ professionalized clergy. So this is not just revivalists or bivocational people that you're not doing tent making ministry anymore by the time you're set up and you've become a church. When you're able to convert and convince the emperor of the Roman Empire to support your cause, or at least decriminalize your cause, you're somewhat of a stable figure. You're a known quantity, let's say. So when you get to that point within the Christian tradition, when authority figures and state apparatus are regularly interacting with Christians and with Christian churches, something changes in the way you have to think about power. Something changes in the way you think about geopolitics. And that is what happened to Christians reflecting on war. That is what happened post Constantinian decree. The church goes from wholesale, completely advocating against any possible participation of Christians within war to a variety of defenses. So, as Gill says, there is no Christian author, none of the early church fathers would support a thoroughgoing militarism or an enthusiastic militarism, and also none of them would even support a type of qualified militarism, the selective militarism. It doesn't happen. In fact, there are numerous accounts of early church fathers saying that Roman soldiers cannot continue to serve in the army, in the Roman army after their conversion. Sometimes it could go so far as not allowing them to take communion or to participate in the Eucharist. And only after the Constantinian decree does this change. So we get it paradigmatically in the writings of Augustine, but that is when this change happens. And it's remarkable to see today the organizations where Christian pacifism still exists as a viable intellectual thread are in Christian traditions that themselves follow something like the sect model. Perhaps they're denominations, but these are small religious communities that are defined not by their connections with secular power, but by their very specific belief-based membership. So it doesn't matter if you're born in Sweden and baptized into the church there, in the Lutheran Church of Sweden. If your family is an Anabaptist, if your family is a Jehovah's Witness, you may support a version of pacifism, but it's also in part predicated on the fact that your religious expression is that today much closer to a sect. So to help you think about this and where you should expect to find people talking about Christian pacifism, just here's your little quotable quote. Fill this on a little Instagram slide or something. Christian pacifism is associated inextricably with Christian primitivism. You got me? Christian pacifism is associated with Christian primitivism. And so this is a movement that is very strongly associated with Baptists. This is a movement that's associated with some Mennonites and other churches that come out of the Radical Reformation, Brethren churches as well, that see themselves as that city on a hill, the few. So the people that are a member of these communities, and I say this as someone who grew up in this type of a Baptist community, although admittedly not thoroughgoing pacifists, they nevertheless saw themselves as holding on to a particular truth, as being guarantors and preservers of a type of Christian tradition that draws its authority from the early church. And so as soon as you see churches fighting battles in the Protestant Reformation over whether or not there should be music at all in churches, when the claims are made to the types of practices used by the early church, you're onto something. You see people saying, they're saying if they didn't do this in Thessalonica, if they didn't do this in Corinth, we shouldn't do this today. And so there's a willful set of blinders that is put on by a number of churches that would call themselves Christian primitivists, that see the early church as the ideal type of religious life, that want to jump over all forms of theological reflection that happened in between, let's say, 2019, or maybe even 1942, whatever it is. You have churches that want to jump from that period of time all the way back to 34 AD and say whatever was happening then is what we want to do now. And because the church, as we understand it now, so the body of Christ, the church cosmic, spread through time, because At that moment, in 34 AD, in the letters of Paul, in the Gospels, the church is itself basically a sect within Judaism. The early Christians they have no need to relate to the state. They are, to a man, to a woman, to a person, they are pacifists, because there is no engagement with the state authority that gives license to enter into war. So this is a lengthy introduction, just why and how this discussion happens. But that's because the texts themselves this week speak for themselves quite plainly. And the thing that they do not say is just why it seems so strange to have all three of these authors discussing with such ease how easily Christianity can square with the idea of armed conflict. And they can only say these things. So you can only find Aquinas naturally appealing to doing whatever the king says. So the sovereign power, who, as we saw last week, ought to be kind, who ought to be mild and serve justice. The virtues of a king might have a specific they might be proscriptive. So this is what a good king should be. But once we assume that the king is good, whatever the sovereign wills in terms of conflict is something that citizens should simply partake in without reservation, because we are putting our own trust in the sovereign power of the king, and any just or unjust decisions that the king makes is not for us, the mere citizens, to question. So, of course, war can be enjoined by regular people because we don't trust the morality of the conflict comes from our decisions or our actions, but fundamentally by the proper use of force and the proper decision to go to war as determined by the just ruler. That is a remarkable difference and change from the idea that he who lives by the sword will die by the sword. So that's not the individual soldier on the ground saying that. That becomes somehow a way to put the request onto the king. Mind you, as you'll see, Aquinas does also take Aquinas does exegesis to prevent clergy from being a part of any armed conflict. In fact, what's not quite clear, that there's a few lines you'll see which demonstrates that those who had committed murder were also prevented from entering the priesthood. So when clergy are prohibited in Aquinas' writing from serving in conflict, he sort of ends the whole passage by saying that since the purpose of war is to kill people, obviously you don't want to make someone do something that would otherwise preclude them from serving as ordained priests. That's because if you had ever killed someone, you were not considered a suitable candidate for entering the priesthood. So post facto, if you're in the priesthood and then you're told you have to kill people, the idea is that you create a logical contradiction. But that's not explicitly clear in what he's referring to. So at the end of the Aquinas passage, when he says that clergy cannot serve, it's because people who had committed murder also could not serve. Now, the piece from Augustine, which sets us all up, and by all of us, I mean the entire Western Church, with regards to how it understands just war, is actually, as you'll see, fairly light on details of just what it means, like what a just war is. And as his piece is written as a reply to Faustus, we encounter a style of writing that is actually remarkably Pauline. So this is like a pastoral letter. So perhaps more so than in other passages, pay attention and read through Gill's introduction of who Faustus was and what the context was to lead to Augustine's writing this. In the same way that when you're doing a Bible study or looking through a New Testament epistle, it's very important to understand why the author was writing as much as you need to grasp the content of the text, why that text is being written, is as important. It's the same here. So pay attention to what he was replying to. And in the last piece, so from Luther, similarly, what we have here is a letter not just written to the general public, but a response to a soldier who had contacted him saying, how can I fight? What can I do as someone who is a Christian, who is also a soldier? So from Luther as well, we get a remarkably pastoral voice speaking about the nature of conflict. Now, in all of these cases, there's a very important thing to note, and that is that the conflict envisioned is fundamentally one of state against state, or sovereign power against sovereign power, because for all three of the authors, they require three things to be in place for a conflict to be just. And the first of those is that the conflict needs to be authorized. So the distinction between private killing and it's not necessarily public killing, but sanctioned killing is the authority that grants the ability for this violence to happen. So this comes from Augustine, picked up wholesale by Aquinas, and inflects all forms of just war thinking in the Christian tradition after that, after Augustine. So the idea is that for a conflict to be valid, it needs to be sanctioned by an authority. Paradigmatically, that authority is the state. It also needs to have a just cause. And so this is the idea that conflicts cannot be or ought not be aggressive, but should be taken up in to defend or for a reason that requires protecting. So whether it's defense or protecting another, this is the just cause that is required in a conflict. And after you have those two things, so you first of all have authority granting the proper dispensation to enter a conflict. You need to have a just cause that you are fighting for. And note that this is a small distinction, but in the 20th century, this obviously matters a lot. What matters more is what we are fighting for rather than what we are fighting against. And so, anytime that you hear World War II described as a just war, it's always because we had to fight the Nazis. I am not going to parse in this lecture how that idea develops. But what I will say is that traditional justifications, traditional versions of just war theory do not focus on how evil the enemy is, but actually on what is being protected. So the fight in these terms would not be against the evil Nazis, but it would be to save and protect the helpless Roma, the helpless Jew, the helpless disabled person. These would be the reasons to enter a conflict using a proper just war theory for good reasons. So it's not because the enemy is so bad, but because those that they are fighting or those that they are killing need protection so much. And that's not just a semantic distinction. The type of rhetoric that we use in these create some of the, if not done properly, create some of the same problems that we actually encounter in Luther. So when Luther in the text says that, what's so bad about war? We're just killing people that are going to die anyway. What really matters is that war provokes enmity, war provokes lust for power and anger. So those are the true evils that emerge in war. You can argue for or against that, but what it is doing, what Luther is saying in those things, is those actions are the things that truly dehumanize the participants, that dehumanize the combatants. And so to relate that to Augustine and to relate it to Nazis, as one does, when we talk about why we fight and focus on the horrible things that are our opponents, we dehumanize the other human participants rather than focus on saving or protecting the humanity of the vulnerable. With me? If not, let me know, send me emails, bring it up in discussion. What I'm saying, though, is that there is a very real way that the rhetoric around war, especially the rhetoric around how we conceive our enemies, actually has an effect upon us, even if we never are combatants ourselves. And then the final reason, the third thing involved in any just war is the right intention of those waging the war. And this is also connected to that rhetoric. You want to fight the Nazis, not to fight the Nazis. You want to fight that battle not just to protect, let's rewind this. You're not fighting the Nazis. What you're doing is liberating and protecting the Jews and the Roma and the disabled. And you are not protecting the Jews, you are not protecting the Roma in order to simply guarantee the stability in Central Europe and make sure that you, that is Western powers, get a bigger slice of the pie than the evil commies. So you're not actually just using those people that you're protecting as a pretext for something else. So you fight for something, not against something. And when you fight for them, it is for good intentions, not for ulterior motives. That is the basis of why and how you fight a just war. So with that said, I will continue more discussion of this in Friday's video, which is going to require the response. This is an introduction, and I want it all in your heads by the time we reflect upon them later on in the week. Yeah. I love you. So there, after a frustrating discussion of conflict, there's hopefully a message of love and peace from this little guy. Let me know if you have questions. Thus ends the teaching for this week, and we will be in touch shortly.
Make a video too, please.
All right, maybe next. Take care, and let me know if you have any questions.